Hello and welcome to Bookspot. This time we will continue our reading of Between Planets by Robert Heinlein. Our protagonist Don is trying to get to his family on Mars and has received the suggestion that maybe the way to do it is to join the Venusian military and get there as a soldier. Don turned McMaster's words over in his mind for the next several days. He had clung stubbornly to the idea that when he got to Venus, he would find some way to wangle passage to Mars. McMasters forced him to regroup his thoughts. It was all very well to talk about getting in some ship headed for Mars, somehow, legally or illegally, paid passenger, crew member, or stowaway. But suppose there were no ships heading for Mars? A lost dog might beat his way back to his master, but a man could not travel a single mile in empty space without a ship, a total impossibility. But that notion of joining the High Guard, it seemed a drastic solution even if it would work, and little as Don knew about the workings of military organization, he held a dark suspicion that the sergeant had oversimplified things. Using the High Guard to get to Mars might prove as unsatisfactory as trying to hitchhike on a Kansas twister. On the other hand, he was at the age at which the idea of military service was glamorous in itself. Had his feelings about Venus been just a touch stronger, he could easily have persuaded himself that it was his duty to throw in with the colonists and sign up, whether it got him to Mars or not. Enlisting held another attraction. It would give pattern to his life. He was beginning to feel the basic gnawing tragedy of the wartime displaced person, the loss of roots. Man needs freedom, but few men are so strong as to be happy with complete freedom. A man needs to be part of a group with accepted and respected relationships. Some men join foreign legions for adventure. Still more swear on a bit of paper in order to acquire a framework of duties, obligations, customs, and taboos, a time to work and a time to loaf, a comrade to dispute with and a sergeant to hate, in short, to belong. Don was as displaced as any wanderer in history. He had not even a planet of his own. He was not conscious of his spiritual need, but he took to staring at the soldiers of the High Guard when he ran across them, imagining what it would be like to wear that uniform. The Nautilus did not land, nor did she tie up to a space station. Instead, her speed was reduced as she approached the planet so that she fell into a 2-hour pole-to-pole parking orbit, only a few hundred miles outside the silvery cloud of Venus' atmosphere. The Venus colonies were too young, too poor to afford the luxury of a great orbiting station in space, but a fast pole-to-pole parking orbit caused a ship to pass over every part of the spinning globe, an orange slice at each pass, like winding string on a ball. A shuttle ship up from the surface could leave any spot on Venus, rendezvous with the ship in orbit, then land on its port of departure or on any other point, having expended a theoretical minimum of fuel. As soon as the Nautilus had parked, such shuttles began to swarm up to her. They were more airplane than spaceship, for although each was sealed and pressurized to operate outside the atmosphere while making contact with orbiting spaceships, each was winged and was powered with the ramjet atmosphere engines as well as rocket jets. Like frogs, they were adapted to two media. A shuttle would be launched to catapult from the surface, her ramjets would take hold, and she would climb on her wings, reaching in the thin, cold heights of the upper atmosphere speeds in excess of 3,000 miles an hour. There, as her ramjets failed for want of air, her rocket jets would take over and kick her forward to orbiting speed of around 12,000 miles an hour and permit her to match it with a spaceship. A nice maneuver. It required both precise mathematical calculation of times, orbits, fuel expenditure, and upper air weather, and piloting virtuosity beyond mathematical calculation. But it saved pennies. Once the shuttle was loaded at the spaceship, it was necessary only to nudge it with its rockets against the orbital direction, whereon the shuttle would drop into the lower orbit, which would eventually intersect the atmosphere and let the pilot take a free ride back to the surface, glider fashion, killing his terrible speed by dipping ever lower into the thickening air. Here again, the pilot must be an artist, for he must both kill his momentum and conserve it so that it would take him where he wanted to go. A shuttle which landed out in the bush 1,000 miles from a port would never make another trip, even if pilot and passengers walked away from the landing. Dawn went down in the Cyrus Buchanan, a trim little craft of hardly 300 feet wingspread. From a port, Dawn watched her being warped in to match airlocks and noticed that the triple globes of interplanet lines had been hastily and inadequately painted out on her nose, and over had been stenciled Midgard Venus Republic. This defaced insignia brought the rebellion home to him almost more than had the bombing of Circumterra. Interplanet was strong as a government. Some said it was the government. Now, hardy rebels had dared to expropriate ships of the Great Transport Trust, paint out the proud triple globes. Dawn felt the winds of history blowing coldly around his ears. McMasters was right. He now believed that no ship would run from here to Mars. When his turn came, he pulled himself along through the airlocks and into the Cyrus Buchanan. The craft's steward was still in the uniform of Interplanet, but the company's insignia had been removed and chevrons had been sewn to his sleeves. With this change had come a change in manner. He handled the passengers efficiently, but without the paid deference of the semi-servant. The trip down was long, tedious, and hot, as an atmosphere-breaking series always is. More than an hour after touch-off, the airfoils first took hold. Shortly, Dawn and the other passengers felt almost full weight pressing them into the cushions. Then the pilot lifted her as he decided his ship was growing too hot, let her ride out and upward in free fall. Over and over this happened, like a stone skipping on water, a nauseating cosmic roller coaster, vastly uncomfortable. Dawn did not mind. He was a spaceman again. His stomach was indifferent to surges of acceleration or even the absence thereof. At first, he was excited at being back in the clouds of Venus. Presently, he was bored. At long last, he was awakened by a change in motion. The craft was whistling down to its final glide, the pilot stabbing ahead with radar for his landing. Then the Cyrus Buchanan touched, bounced, and quivered to the rushing water under her hull. She slowed and stopped. After a considerable wait, she was towed to her berth. The steward stood up and shouted, "New London, Republic of Venus, have your papers ready." Chapter 8. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests. Matthew 8:20. Dawn's immediate purpose was to ask his way to the IT&T office, there to file a radiogram to his parents. But he was unable to leave at once. The passengers had to have their papers inspected, and they themselves were subjected to physical examination and questioning. Dawn found himself, hours later, still sitting outside the security office, waiting to be questioned. His irregular status had sent him to the end of the line. In addition to being hungry, tired, and bored, his arms itched. They were covered from shoulder to wrists with needle pricks caused by extensive testing for immunities to the many weird diseases and fungus-like infections of the second planet. Having once lived there, he retained immunity to the peculiar perils of Venus. A good thing, he mused, else he would have had to waste weeks in quarantine while being inoculated. He was rubbing his arms and wondering whether or not he should kick up a fuss when the door opened and his name was called. He went inside. An officer of the middle guard sat at the desk looking at Dawn's papers. "Donald Harvey?" "Yes, sir." "Frankly, your case puzzles me. We've had no trouble identifying you. Your prints check with those recorded when you were here before. But you aren't a citizen. Sure I am. My mother was born here. Hmm. The official drummed on his desktop. I'm not a lawyer. I get your point. But after all, when your mother was born, there wasn't any such nation as the Republic of Venus. Looks to me as if you were a test case, with precedents still to be established. Then where does that leave me? Don said slowly. I don't know. I'm not sure you have any legal right to stay here at all. But I don't want to stay here. I'm just passing through. Eh? I'm on my way to Mars. Oh, that. I've seen your papers. Too bad. Now let's talk sense, shall we? I'm going to Mars, Don repeated stubbornly. Sure, sure, and I'm going to heaven when I die. In the meantime, you are a resident of Venus, whether we like it or not. No doubt the courts will decide eventually whether you are a citizen as well. Mr. Harvey, I've decided to turn you loose. Huh? Don was startled. It had not occurred to him that this liberty could be in question. Yes, you don't seem like a threat to the safety of the Republic of Venus, and I don't fancy holding you in quarantine indefinitely. Just keep your nose clean and phone in your address after you find a place to stay. Here are your papers. Don thanked him, picked up his bags, and left quickly. Once outside, he stopped to give his arms a good scratching. At the dock in front of the building, an amphibious launch was tied up. Its coxswain was lounging at the helm. Don said, "Excuse me, but I want to send a radio. Can you tell me where I should go?" "Sure. IT&T building, Buchanan Street, Main Island, just down in the Nautilus." "That's right. How do I get there?" "Jump in. I'll be making another trip in about 5 minutes. Any more passengers to come?" "I don't think so." "You don't sound like a fog eater." The coxswain looked him over. "Raised on the stuff," Don assured him, "but I've been away at school for several years." "Just slid in under the wire, didn't you?" "Yeah, I guess so." "Lucky for you. No place like home, I guess." The coxswain looked happily around at the murky sky and the dark waters. Shortly he started his engine and cast off lines. The little vessel slopped its way through narrow channels, around islands and bars barely above water. A few minutes later, Don disembarked at the foot of Buchanan Street, main thoroughfare of New London, capital of the planet. There were several people loafing around the landing dock. They looked him over. 2 of them were runners for rooming houses. He shook them off and started up Buchanan Street. The street was crowded with people, but was narrow, meandering, and very muddy. 2 lighted signs, one on each side of the street, shone through the permanent fog. One read, "Enlist now, your nation needs you." The other exhorted, "Drink Coca-Cola." The IT&T building turned out to be several hundred yards down the street, almost at the far side of Main Island, but it was easy to find as it was the largest building on the island. Don climbed over the combing at the entrance and found himself in the local office of Interplanetary Telephone and Televideo Corporation. A young lady was seated behind a counter desk. "I'd like to send a radiogram," he said to her. "That's what we're here for." She handed him a pad and a stylus. "Thanks." Don composed a message with much wrinkling of forehead, trying to make it both reassuring and informative in the fewest words. Presently he handed it in. The girl raised her eyebrows when she saw the address, but made no comment. She counted the words, consulted a book, and said, "That'll be $187.50. Don counted it out, noting anxiously what a hole that made in his assets. She glanced at the notes and pushed them back. "Are you kidding?" "What's the matter?" "Offering me Federation money. Trying to get me in trouble?" "Oh." Don felt again a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach that was getting to be almost a habit. "Look, I'm just down in the Nautilus. I haven't had time to exchange this stuff. Can I send the message collect? To Mars? Well, what should I do? Well, there's the bank just down the street. If I were you, I'd try there. I guess so, thanks. He started to pick up his message. She stopped him. I was about to say that you can file your message if you like. You've got 2 weeks in which to pay for it. Huh? Why, thanks. Well, don't thank me. It can't go out for a couple of weeks, and you don't have to pay until we're ready to send it. 2 weeks? Why? Because Mars is right smack-o back of the sun now. It wouldn't punch through. We'll have to wait on the swing. Well, what's the matter with the relay? There's a war on, or hadn't you noticed? Oh, Don felt foolish. We're still accepting private messages both ways on the Venus-Terra channel, subject to paraphrase and censoring, but we couldn't guarantee that your message would be relayed from Terra to Mars. Or could you instruct someone on Earth to pay for a second transmission? I'm afraid not. Maybe it's just as well. They might not relay it for you, even if you could get someone to foot the bill. The Federation censors might kill it. So give me that traffic and I'll file it. You can pay for it later. She glanced at the message. Looks like you sort of ran into hard luck. How old are you? She glanced again at the form. Don Harvey. Don told her. You look older. I'm older than you are. I guess that makes me your grandmother. If you need any more advice, just stop in and ask Grandmother Isabel, Isabel Costello. Thanks, Isabel. Not at all. Usual IT&T service. She gave him a warm smile. Don left feeling somewhat confused. The bank was near the center of the island. Don remembered having passed it. The sign on the glass read, Bank of America and Hong Kong. Over this had been stuck strips of masking tape, and under it was another sign, handwritten in whitewash, New London Trust and Investment Company. Don went in, picked the shortest queue, and presently explained his wants. The teller hooked a thumb toward a desk back of a rail. See him. At the desk was seated an elderly Chinese dressed in a long black gown. As Don approached, he stood up, bowed, and said, May I help you, sir? Don again explained and laid his wad of bills on the banker's desk. The man looked at it without touching it. I am so sorry. What's the matter? You are past the date when one may legally exchange Federation currency for money of the Republic. But I haven't had a chance to before. I just got in. I am very sorry. I do not make the regulations. But what am I to do? The banker closed his eyes, then opened them. In this imperfect world, one must have money. Have you something to offer as security? I guess not. Just my clothes in these bags. No jewelry? Well, I've got a ring, but I don't suppose it's worth much. Let me see. Don took off the ring Dr. Jefferson had mailed to him and handed it over. The Chinese stuck a watchmaker's loop in his eye and examined it. I am afraid you are right. Not even true amber, merely plastic. Still, a symbol of security will bind an honest man quite as much as chains. I'll advance 50 credits on it. Don took the ring back and hesitated. The ring could not possibly be worth 1/10 of that sum, and his stomach was reminding him that flesh has its insistent demands. Still, his mother had spent at least twice that amount to make sure that the ring reached him, or the paper it had been wrapped in, he corrected himself, and Dr. Jefferson had died in a fashion somehow connected with this same bauble. He put it back on his finger. That wouldn't be fair. I guess I'd better find a job. A man of pride. There's always work to be found in a new and growing city. Good luck. When you have found employment, come back and we can arrange an advance against your wages. The banker reached into the folds of his gown, pulled out a single credit note. But eat first. A full belly steadies the judgment. Do me the honor of accepting this as our welcome to the newcomer." His pride said no. His stomach said yes. Don took it and said, "Thanks. That's awfully kind of you. I'll pay it back first chance. Instead, pay it forward to some other brother who needs it." The banker touched a button on his desk, then stood up. Don said goodbye and left. There was a man loitering at the door of the bank. He let Don get a step or two ahead, then followed him, but Don paid him no attention, being very busy with his own worries. It was slowly beginning to grow on him that the bottom had dropped out of his world, and that there might be no way to put it back together. He had lived in security all his life. He had never experienced emotionally in his own person the basic historical fact that mankind lives always by the skin of its teeth, sometimes winning, more often losing, and dying. But never quitting. In 100 yards of Muddy Street, he began to grow up, take stock of his situation. He was more than 100 million miles from where he meant to be. He had no way at once to let his parents know where he was, nor was it a simple matter of waiting 2 weeks. He was flat broke, unable to pay the high tariff. Broke, hungry, and no place to sleep, no friends, not even an acquaintance, unless he recalled you counted Sir Isaac, but for all he knew, his dragon friend might be on the other side of the planet. Certainly not close enough at hand to affect the ham and eggs problem. He decided to settle that problem at once by spending the note the banker had given him. He recalled a restaurant a short distance back and stopped suddenly, whereupon a man jostled him. Don said, "Excuse me," and noted that the man was another Chinese, noted it without surprise, as nearly half of the contract labor shipped in the early days of the Venerian colonies had been Orientals. It did seem to him that the man's face was familiar. A fellow passenger on the Nautilus? Then he recalled that he had seen him at the dock of the foot of the street. "My fault," the man answered. "I should look where I'm going. Sorry I bumped you." He smiled most charmingly. "No harm done," Don replied, "but it was my fault. I suddenly decided to turn around and go back." "Back to the bank?" "Huh? None of my business, but I saw you coming out of the bank." "As a matter of fact," Don answered, "I wasn't going back to the bank. I was looking for a restaurant, and I remembered seeing one back there." The man glanced at his bags. "Just get in. Just down in the Nautilus. You don't want that restaurant, not unless you have money to throw away. It's strictly a tourist trap." Don thought about the single credit note in his pocket and worried. Where can a chap get a bite to eat? A good cheap restaurant." The man took his arm. "I'll show you. A place down by the water run by a cousin of mine." "Oh, I wouldn't want to put you to any trouble." "Not at all. I was about to refresh the inner man myself. By the way, my name is Johnny Ling." "Glad to know you, Mr. Ling. I'm Don Harvey." The restaurant was in a blind alley off the foot of Buchanan Street. Its sign advertised, "Two Worlds Dining Room, tables for ladies. Welcome, spacemen." 3 move-overs were hanging around the entrance, sniffing the odors and pressing their twitching noses against the screen door. Johnny Ling pushed them aside and ushered Don in. A fat Cantonese stood behind the counter, presiding over both range and cash register. Ling called out, "Hi, Charlie." The fat man answered, "Hello, Johnny," then broke into fluent cursing, mixing Cantonese, English, Portuguese, and whistling speech impartially. One of the move-overs had managed to slip in when the door was open and was making a beeline for the pie rack, his little hooves clicking on the floor. Moving very fast despite his size, the man called Charlie headed him off, took him by the ear, and marched him out. Still cursing, Charlie returned to the pie rack, picked out half a pie that had seen better times, and returned to the door. He tossed the pie to the fawns, who scrambled for it, bleating and whimpering. "If you didn't feed 'em, Charlie," commented Ling, "they wouldn't hang around. You mind your own damn business." Several customers were eating at the counter. They paid no attention to the incident. Ling moved closer to the cook and said, "Back room empty?" Charlie nodded and turned his back. Ling led Don through a swinging door. They ended up in a booth in the back of the building. Don sat down and picked up a menu, wondering what he could get that would stretch his one credit as far as possible. Ling took it from him. "Let me order for you. Charlie is a really #1 cook." "But you are my guest. Don't argue. I insist." Charlie showed up at that point, stepping silently through the booth's curtain. He and Ling exchanged remarks in a rapid sing-song. He went away, returned shortly with crisp hot egg rolls. The aroma was wonderful, and Don's stomach put a stop to his protests. The egg rolls were followed by a main dish which Don could not place. It was Chinese cooking, but it certainly was not the chop suey of the trade. Don thought that he could identify Venusian vegetables out of his childhood in it, but he could not be sure. Whatever it was just what he needed. He began to feel a warm glow of content and ceased to worry about anything. While he ate, he found he was telling Ling his life history, with emphasis on recent events that had landed him unexpectedly on Venus. The man was easy to talk to, and it did not seem polite simply to sit wolfing his host's food and saying nothing. Ling sat back presently and wiped his mouth. "You've certainly had an odd time of it, Don. What are you going to do now?" Don frowned. "I wish I knew. I've got to find a job of some sort and a place to sleep. After that, I've got to scrape up or save up or borrow enough money to send word to my folks. They'll be worried." "You brought some money with you?" "Huh? Oh, sure, but it's Federation money. I can't spend it." "And Uncle Tom wouldn't change it for you. He's a flinty-hearted old so-and-so in spite of his smiles. He's still a pawnbroker at bottom." "Uncle Tom? The banker is your uncle?" "Huh? Oh, no, just a matter of speaking. He set up a hawk shop here a long time ago. Prospectors would come in and pawn their Geiger counters. Next time out, he'd grubstake 'em. Pretty soon he owned half the hot pits around here and was a banker. But we still call him Uncle Tom." Don had a vague feeling that Ling was too anxious to deny the relationship, but he did not pursue the thought as it did not matter to him. Ling was continuing. "You know, Don, the bank isn't the only place where you can change Federation money." "What do you mean?" Ling dipped his forefinger in a puddle of water on the table and traced out the universal credit sign. "Of course, it's the only legal place. Would that worry you?" "Well, it isn't as if there was anything wrong about changing it. It's an arbitrary law, and they didn't ask you when they passed it. After all, it's your money. That's right, isn't it?" "I suppose so. It's your money, and you can do what you please with it. But this talk is strictly on the quiet. You understand that?" Don didn't say anything. So we'll see how much more trouble Don can get into in his first day on Venus next time.